Have you ever heard of Isabel Ides?
I can't say that I have.
Well, she was this amazing Maka Indian woman, lived to be 101 years old.
Wow, 101.
Yeah, and, she lived right there on the edge of the continent.
So like Pacific Northwest.
Exactly. And she was so dedicated to passing on the traditions of her people, things like basket weaving and the Maka language.
I can only imagine how much knowledge she held.
Oh, people would travel from all over just to learn from her. She was like a living embodiment of generations of history and wisdom. But get this, alongside all of that, she was a deeply devoted Sunday school teacher.
Really? So her Christian faith was a major part of her life too.
Oh, absolutely. It was central to who she was. And that kind of gets to the heart of what we're going to be exploring today. Did Isabel's deep connection to her Maka heritage, did that matter to God as much as her profound faith?
That's a really interesting question, especially in our world today. Everything feels so interconnected.
Right. We hear all the time about globalization, about how economies and cultures are becoming more and more intertwined.
And while there are definitely some benefits to that,
Right.
increased trade and communication stuff,
Sure.
we also have to think about the impact on those more localized ways of life, those unique traditions and values that have been passed down for centuries.
It's like that concept Alan Greenspan talked about, that creative destruction thing.
Oh, right. How the rise of new industries and technologies can kind of push out the old ones.
Exactly, and how that can lead to job losses and all sorts of disruption. But what if we look at that same idea through a cultural lens? Could globalization, in a way, be leading to a kind of creative destruction of those deeply held ethnic and cultural values?
That's a really provocative thought because those values aren't just some commodity that can be easily replaced, right?
Right.
They're part of the very fabric of who people are.
So for this deep dive, we really want to dig into how God views ethnicity within this whole landscape of globalization.
It is a fascinating question. How do we hold on to the richness of our local cultures when the world seems to be pushing us towards this more, I don't know, uniform global experience?
It's a tension, for sure. So let's see what our sources have to say about God's perspective on all of this, starting with the very beginning. What does it say about how God views human culture and creativity in the first place?
Well, one of the first things that jumps out is this idea that God didn't create a world where everyone looks and acts the same. He gave humanity this incredible gift of creativity.
Right.
And it's that creativity expressed and kind of refined over generations by communities in specific places that has led to, well, this amazing diversity of cultures that we see all over the world.
It's like this beautiful tapestry, right? All these unique threads woven together.
Exactly. And what's really striking is that the sources actually suggest that God doesn't just tolerate these different cultures. He actually seems to endorse them as like a path to human flourishing.
It's interesting because the material points to so many examples of specific cultural areas where God gives his blessing, like starting with the family unit, right?
Oh, absolutely. And then, moving on to the formation of organized societies or states.
And how about all the different ways that people work and provide for themselves and their families?
Right. And we can't forget the incredible diversity in how people worship and express their faith.
Oh, and all the amazing art and music and storytelling that's come out of different cultures.
Exactly. And the pursuit of knowledge, education, the passing down of wisdom through generations, and even something as simple as the joy of celebrating together through festivals and holidays.
All of those things, they're like these vibrant expressions of culture. And the sources are saying that from the very beginning, God has affirmed and celebrated them.
It's not just a passive, oh, well, that's nice. It's more like an active, yes, this is good. This is how I intended for humanity to live and thrive.
And it goes even deeper than just those broad categories. The sources highlight how God gave specific guidelines, like laws, to help shape the way that cultures functioned. And these weren't arbitrary rules, they had real purpose.
Like, think about the laws that God gave to protect the environment, to ensure that people treated each other justly, and especially to care for the most vulnerable members of society.
Right. The widows and orphans, the foreigners, the poor, those who were in debt. There was this real emphasis on creating a culture of justice and compassion.
And I think that's so important because it speaks to God's character. He cares about how we treat each other, how we structure our societies, and how we interact with the world around us.
It's like he's saying, I've given you this amazing world, this beautiful creation. Now here's how to live in it well.
Exactly. And remember those passages in Deuteronomy where God describes the promised land? All that abundance, the flowing rivers, the fertile fields, the fruit trees, even the valuable resources like iron and brass.
That really struck me too. It's like God is saying, look, I've provided for you in this very specific, tangible place. And that physical reality, that environment, becomes a foundational part of the culture that develops there.
It shapes how people live, what they value, and how they interact with each other.
I love how the sources use that vivid Old Testament imagery to illustrate this, like oil, symbolizing joy, wine, representing celebration.
Strong friendships being compared to iron, the blessing of children.
These are all these rich, concrete elements that are woven together to create the fabric of a culture. It's not just abstract ideas, it's real life, lived out in specific contexts.
And that leads to a really important point for us to consider as we navigate this world that's becoming increasingly globalized.
Right.
The sources contrast these very rooted, tangible local realities with what they call the immersive nature of global and virtual experiences.
Like, think about the constant barrage of media, the ups and downs of the stock market.
The 24/7 news cycle that just never seems to stop.
Right. All those things can definitely connect us in certain ways, but there's also a danger there. The sources suggest that we can become so absorbed in that global or virtual sphere that we start to lose touch with, like the fundamental rhythms of life in our own local communities.
The changing seasons, the needs of our neighbors, the unique beauty of our own particular place in the world.
I was really struck by a quote that the sources brought up from Sambina Uzman. He was an African filmmaker and writer, and he talked about how the rise of cinema, television, and video had changed the way that culture was being passed down through generations.
Interesting.
Yeah, he observed that older generations were starting to feel like irrelevant almost, like they weren't the primary holders of wisdom and knowledge anymore because these new forms of media were becoming so dominant.
I can see how that would be unsettling.
Yeah, he even talked about this feeling of the older generation becoming absent in our own families and how society was becoming more and more impoverished, emptying itself of its creative substance.
That's a powerful statement. And it really makes you think about how globalization might be, in a way, contributing to a kind of cultural amnesia.
It's like we're forgetting the stories and traditions and values that have shaped who we are.
And that brings us to a really important question, like, what is it about these local cultural patterns that makes them so valuable? Why should we even be concerned about this potential erosion?
Yeah, why should we care if certain aspects of our culture fade away?
Well, the sources argue that those local patterns are so essential because they provide a framework for us to understand ourselves, to know where we come from and where we belong. They help us to, discern our potential, acknowledge our limits.
They help us to recognize the resources that are available to us, both the natural resources and the human resources within our communities.
And they give us a sense of the natural flow of life, those rhythms and patterns that have guided people for generations.
It's like those cultural patterns help us to navigate those big life events. Things like raising children, dealing with job loss, welcoming a new baby into the family.
Or coping with serious illness or the loss of loved ones. These are all experiences that are profoundly shaped by the cultural context that we're in.
The sources use the example of Filipino culture, which, is known for its strong emphasis on family and hospitality.
And the economic freedom that women have within that society.
And their ability to find contentment with even modest means, a real cultural inclination towards relaxation and enjoying life.
All beautiful qualities.
And the sources connect those positive cultural attributes to the theological idea that every good and perfect gift comes from above. Like it says in James 1.1c and in Colossians 2.3.
It's suggesting that those cultural strengths, those beautiful aspects of Filipino culture are, in a way, gifts from God that have been expressed in a unique way within that particular community.
I love that perspective.
What's even more fascinating is that the sources go on to suggest that God actually delights in diversity itself. Think about the incredible variety we see in the natural world, all the different smells, the unique pattern of every snowflake, the billions of individual personalities that make up humanity.
That's a great point. God clearly loves variety.
Right. So the sources are proposing that God's love for variety extends to cultural expressions as well. He's given us this capacity to create this incredible tapestry of human cultures, each one with its own unique beauty and value.
Now, that's not to say that all cultures are perfect, of course. The sources are clear that cultures are shaped by human hands and therefore can be influenced by sin and brokenness.
Yeah, we have to exercise discernment.
But the material specifically states that ethnic pride in itself is not necessarily sinful. It's like that feeling of pride that a parent feels at their child's graduation.
Right. It's not about thinking that your child is better than everyone else.
It's about celebrating their unique journey and the bond that you share.
And the sources give us a really helpful definition of what ethnicity actually is. It's that deep sense of identification with a group of people who share a common culture and history.
And that history includes both the triumphs and the struggles, the heroes and the martyrs. It's like being part of a family. It's not something you earn. It's a birthright.
You're born into it.
And the anthropologist Clifford Geertz talked about this fundamental human need for a vision of public purpose that's rooted in a shared understanding of reality.
Right.
He argued that this idea of being just a citizen of the world is often too abstract to give people that deep sense of belonging and purpose.
It's too vague, too general.
But being part of an ethnic group, that provides those essential elements,
Shared celebrations, common values, a sense of direction, a feeling of being rooted in a meaningful place within the story of humanity.
Like you're part of something bigger than yourself.
Now, building on this idea of culture as something that's divinely inspired, the sources introduce the perspective of theologian Eric Sauer. And he basically says that all those human achievements, all the things that we create and build and develop as part of our cultures, those aren't at odds with God's will.
Interesting.
They're actually a vital part of our human dignity.
Okay.
They're part of how we fulfill God's command to, take possession of the earth.
I see. So we're meant to cultivate and create.
Exactly. And the material gives us some really basic examples of what he calls this divine charter for human endeavor. Think about agriculture, developing ways to cultivate the land and provide food for people.
That's huge.
And technology, coming up with innovative solutions to problems.
And industry, figuring out how to produce the things that we need to survive and thrive.
And then, all the skilled craftspeople who use their hands to create beautiful and useful things.
And artists who express truth and beauty through their work.
All of these things are presented as gifts from God that enrich human existence.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. But of course, we have to acknowledge the reality that while culture in its essence might be part of God's design, it's also vulnerable to the corrupting influence of sin.
Yeah, nothing in this world is untouched by our fallen nature.
The sources are honest about the fact that instead of that intended beauty and harmony, we often see a lot of brokenness and conflict within and between cultures.
Yeah, sometimes those very things that we create and value, they can become sources of division and even violence.
So that brings us to the really important question of when does ethnicity cross that line and become an idol?
Right, because the sources are clear that ethnicity itself isn't inherently bad, but it can become a problem when we elevate it to the status of the ultimate good.
It's like anything else in life, wealth, power, even relationships.
Right.
They can all be good things, but they become destructive when they become the center of our lives, when they become the things that we worship above all else.
And when ethnicity becomes an idol, that's when we see racism, intergroup conflict, wars, and even ethnic cleansing. It can be incredibly destructive.
So given this kind of delicate balance, the inherent value of ethnicity, but also the potential dangers of its idolization, what does all of this mean for mission, especially in our world today where everything is so interconnected?
Well, the sources lay out 4 key ways that mission should be responding to the potentially dehumanizing aspects of globalization.
And the first one is to affirm the local.
No, that doesn't mean just blindly accepting everything about a particular culture without any discernment.
Right.
But it does mean working alongside local believers to identify those things that truly align with God's values, while also genuinely appreciating and valuing that local culture as a unique and beautiful gift.
And that involves taking some concrete actions, right?
Absolutely, like learning and speaking the local language.
That's so important.
The sources highlight this really interesting observation from Lamin Sanneh, who pointed out that unlike some other faiths, Christianity uniquely believes that God speaks your language.
Wow, that's powerful.
That he communicates directly with every culture in its own tongue.
That's amazing. And it means that we need to be willing to learn those languages to enter into those cultures in a really deep and meaningful way.
Exactly. And then there are all those practical ways that we can support the local community.
Choosing to shop at local businesses, supporting local artists, seeking out locally owned accommodations when we travel,
Actively learning from the local customs and traditions.
respecting indigenous knowledge, and really just being present in the community, getting to know people, building relationships.
All of those things demonstrate a genuine affirmation of the value of that local culture.
The sources even bring up an analogy from The Lord of the Rings, which I'm a huge nerd, so I loved this.
Oh, I love it.
They remind us that even in this epic battle against global evil, the final victory wasn't complete until the small places, the local communities, were restored.
That's such a good point.
It's a reminder that the global perspective is important, but it has to be grounded in a real love and appreciation for the local.
Absolutely. And, the sources also address a potential blind spot that can sometimes show up in, like missionary training.
Okay.
They talk about this tendency for missionaries who come from more dominant cultures to unintentionally impose their own cultural norms and preferences
Right.
as if they were like universal expressions of God's will.
It can be so subtle.
It really can.
Yeah.
And while they acknowledge the incredible dedication of many past missionaries, especially their efforts to learn local languages and cultures,
For sure.
the sources pose a really challenging question for contemporary missions.
What's a
We often talk about the importance of contextualization, but are we really committed to living it out? Like in the same way that Jesus entered fully into the human experience, are we willing to truly immerse ourselves in the cultures that we're called to serve?
to become one of them?
To lay aside our own assumptions and preferences and really seek to understand God's heart for that particular people and place.
That's challenging.
It is.
Yeah.
And that leads to the second implication from the sources, which is to be pilgrims.
Okay, I like that.
They talk about how the nature of identity is becoming so much more complex in our world today, where so many individuals hold multiple ethnic affiliations.
Right.
They use the example of children who might have both Filipino and Native American heritage, showing how those neat little categories that we like to put people in, they often fall short.
Absolutely.
They also point to the emergence of these broader categories like Asian Pacific American.
Sure.
It's a census designation, but it also represents this really significant and evolving ethnic grouping.
And it's a reality that so many people experience, right? This feeling of having multiple identities or of not quite fitting into any one box.
And the sources really emphasize the importance of respecting how individuals choose to identify themselves, even if it complicates our preconceived notions or, our statistical categories.
So we need to be asking questions like, how do refugees navigate their identities? How do biracial individuals make sense of their heritage? How do people who embrace aspects of global culture while still holding on to their own traditions, how do they find their place?
And the message that comes through so strongly is that the gospel offers a home for everyone, no matter how complex their background or their identity might be.
God sees beyond those labels.
He sees us as unique individuals, each with our own story, and he welcomes us all into his family.
And while our local cultures are these incredible gifts, ultimately we're all pilgrims on a journey towards that heavenly city.
Like it talks about in Jeremiah 29:7 and Hebrews 11:8-10.
We're citizens of heaven, first and foremost. The third implication from the sources is a call to build bridges.
I love that imagery.
And they share this really inspiring story about Zia, a blind Afghan Christian who dedicated his life to serving his own community. He actually mastered multiple languages so that he could share the gospel with as many people as possible.
Wow, that's incredible.
And his life is this beautiful example of how the gospel can transcend those cultural boundaries while still being deeply rooted in a local context.
And I think it highlights the need for those genuine, heartfelt connections between people from different cultures.
Connections that go beyond just the superficial level of economics and technology.
The sources draw on the insights of thinkers like Thomas Friedman, Clifford Geertz, and Manuel Castells, who've all talked about this potential disconnect between the increasing global integration that we see and the richness of our personal lived experiences.
Like the way that globalization can sometimes feel very impersonal, even dehumanizing at times.
Castells even coined the term structural schizophrenia to describe this potential fragmentation within individuals and societies.
That's kind of a scary thought.
It is. And that's where the role of the church becomes so vital. The sources emphasize the importance of the church in actively building bridges of understanding and connection across those cultural divides.
Especially during times when those civil and political ties might be strained or broken.
Like, the church can be this incredible force for peace and reconciliation.
And that's really at the heart of our mission, isn't it? To share God's love with the whole world, not just our own little corner of it.
And the sources remind us that this call to build bridges, it goes all the way back to the very beginning of the biblical story. God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 that he would be a blessing to all nations.
And David's prayer in Psalm 67 for God to make his face shine on all peoples.
And Paul's mission to the Gentiles, as he describes it in Romans 15.
And ultimately, John's vision in Revelation of that multitude from every tribe and tongue and nation worshiping God together.
It's a beautiful picture of what God desires for humanity. And it's a call to action for all of us who follow Jesus.
So the fourth and final implication that the sources bring up is the importance of nurturing ethnic churches.
Okay, now this is something that can be a little bit tricky to talk about, right?
Especially given the history of segregation and racial division within the church and society as a whole.
Yeah, but the sources address it head on, asking whether the existence of ethnic-specific churches is inherently problematic.
Good question.
And their perspective is actually really nuanced. They argue that ethnic churches can be biblically justified based on the doctrine of creation itself. The idea that different cultures, as unique expressions of God's creativity, they often have distinct and valuable perspectives to offer on truth and beauty, and even on the application of faith in their everyday lives.
So while the ideal might be that every church should be this completely welcoming community for everyone, regardless of their background,
the reality is that some people just thrive in those culturally specific environments where they can worship God in their heart language and express their faith through those familiar forms of their own heritage.
and it's not about exclusion, right?
Exactly. What becomes problematic is when there's a lack of love and unity within the broader body of Christ.
Especially when those majority-dominated churches fail to recognize and really address the specific needs and contributions of those ethnic minority communities.
Yeah, and the sources emphasize how much ethnic churches actually enrich the whole Christian community. Like those diverse tiles in a mosaic or the different colors in a kaleidoscope.
Each one adding its own unique beauty to the overall picture.
And ethnic churches can often be like a launching pad for global missions. They have those natural connections with international communities. They understand the culture and language. They can really help to facilitate those cross-cultural partnerships.
And the sources remind us of those practical implications that are laid out in James chapter 2. If there are ethnic churches in our communities that are facing real tangible needs, whether it's for resources, language-specific materials, support for their leaders,
Right.
we as the wider Christian community, we can't just ignore those needs.
True faith requires action. So as we bring this deep dive to a close, let's just recap some of those key insights.
Okay.
The sources are saying that ethnicity is this precious and purposeful gift from God. It's a reflection of his incredible creativity and his love for diversity.
But like anything else in this fallen world, ethnicity has the potential to become an idol if we allow it to become the ultimate source of our identity.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems like we've been talking about.
So what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to live in this increasingly interconnected but also often very fractured world?
The sources give us a pretty clear path forward.
Okay.
We're called to actively affirm the value of those local cultures around us.
To recognize them as these unique expressions of God's creativity.
To embrace our primary identity as citizens of heaven, as pilgrims who are just passing through this world.
To intentionally build bridges of understanding and connection across those cultural divides.
And to nurture and support the unique contributions of ethnic churches within our own communities.
So this leads us to a final really important question for you, our listener.
In your own life, in your own sphere of influence, how can you participate in this?
How can you affirm the value of the diverse cultures that surround you?
How can you help to build those bridges of understanding and connection?
How can you ensure that ethnicity is honored and treasured as the gift that it is without allowing it to become a source of division or something that's ultimately worshipped above God himself?
It's a question that we hope will stay with you long after this deep dive is over.
Because it's a conversation that needs to continue.
It really does.
In our churches, in our communities, and in our world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.